Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick video about the Sony A1 and firmware. Because after all, today, on May 10th, 2023, Sony announced version 1.32 for the A1. Now, many of you have been waiting for a significant firmware update. I understand. This is not that day. Instead, it's a stability release, and if I had to wager whether or not this is signaling the end or the beginning, I think this is the beginning for what is likely the last firmware update, big update, we will see to the A1, because Sony tends to roll out these sort of stability firmware updates ahead of significant change. And, this is a 2-year-old camera. I don't anticipate our minds being blown by what Sony will deliver. I think it's more along the lines of what people expect. But tempered expectations. Now, a lot of you have been calling for features from the R5, of course, not the AI processing unit. We can't, through software add hardware, but have been calling for a lot of the niceties that have been brought to the R5 to be brought here to the A1, or even some of the features from the FX3, and I completely get it. This is the most expensive camera that Sony makes, and it would be great if Sony makes it even better. But I will be a voice of reason here and remind everyone that when you purchased the A1, it was the best camera on the market. You didn't purchase it with the hopes of it getting better. You purchased it for what it literally was about to be in your hand. And I think that perspective, for whatever reason, has been lost, and it's kind of nuts, because we don't buy anything else with the mentality that manufacturers are going to come back, revisit, and fix them. In fact, the whole idea of firmware updates historically for cameras, at the very least, was to establish and address issues that maybe were missed in production that needed to be patched afterwards. The idea was not to make it more robust, add new features. No, that's what the launch is for. Now, don't get me wrong, Sony launching something like the ZV-E1 and announcing that the 4K 120 would come in the form of a firmware update a month after launch, that is a direct example of a manufacturer, Sony in this case, who we are talking about, right, making it clear that a firmware update is going to change functionality on a brand new product. And that's because, obviously, the code that they needed to write, or the work they had to do on that firmware, did not make the date. They missed it. That doesn't mean they can't sell the camera and make that promise. But the idea that there is a silent promise that we're all waiting on is so ridiculous. I mean, this is a corporation that operates to make money, and I'm sorry, I'm not here to support their profit mongering, but I will be here to let all of you know that we still have to reside inside of reality. I mean, you want to dream, you can dream, but that cannot be a firm expectation. No manufacturer is making any product, especially electronics. I mean, don't get me into tablets, phones, laptops, desktops. None of them are making it with the ideology that down the road it's going to be better or improved upon. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Down the road, you're going to be replacing it. And I'm not saying you need to replace the A1. In fact, I got this more than a year into its existence, and I was just as happy because it still was the best, and to this day, still is the best, in light of that Nikon announcement today, in my opinion, still the best photographic tool on the market for me. And that's without any firmware updates. That's just how good the A1 is. So if you bought this, with the promise of future updates, I feel like you came into the purchase with the wrong approach, because that's just not the way the business works. And for anyone to say that they're a professional photographer and they're done with Sony because they didn't get new features on the A1, also totally, I hate to use the word crazy because it's an insult to people with real challenges. But yeah, you've lost it, because that, again, is not how the business works. If Sony can drop software on this and improve certain things and make the camera sell better than they already have, you better believe they want to do that. But if they see it as being a move that would potentially cannibalize sales of another product or hurt them, why would they do that? I mean, corporations do not have to hurt themselves to make customers happy. And if that becomes something that turns customers off enough, customers will make the decision to no longer do business with that company. But that's not what's going on here. So all of these rumblings or grumblings of different users saying like, I'm done with Sony because the A1 hasn't gotten the features that were, exist in the R5 or in the FX3, I think is nuts. The same applies to the A7S III. And I do still believe Sony is going to update the A1 as well as the A7S III. I don't think they're going to give us the kitchen sink because they are in business to make money. And that's what new models are for. Why people are pretending that Sony is greedy in a way that other manufacturers are not, I have no idea, but it's time to bring that expectation, as I said, back to reality. You do not buy a car with the anticipation that it's going to get better over time. You do not buy a smartphone or a computer with the expectation that it will get better over time. You certainly don't expect the manufacturers to come and somehow, through software, match new specifications on new hardware, because that's totally ridiculous. So, just trying to be a voice of reason here. The A1, in my opinion, is still the best camera on the market. The stability firmware update today, I haven't gone out and shot with it. What I've read so far from professional photographers is that they are seeing an improvement in the eye autofocus hit rate with birds specifically, not necessarily with humans. I will have my own feedback once I start using it with the new firmware, but this idea that Sony owes us something beyond delivering what we actually gave them money for is ridiculous. Again, I am not condoning putting out broken products and not supporting them, or a firmware update creating a new issue and them walking away. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people being greedy and pointing their finger at Sony and saying they are greedy when they're a corporation. They're not a person. This is what they're in business to do, make new cameras. And quite frankly, the A1 Mark II, or whatever Sony will end up calling it, yeah, it's going to be better than this. It's going to have the AI unit, of course, from the R5 that's also in the ZV-E1, and it'll likely have new features, maybe even something more revolutionary than the stacked sensor system we've gotten here. But again, the idea that they should be giving away, firmware updates that will make the A1 as good as or close to as good as brand new hardware when it already is better than 99.9% of what exists on the planet with its old firmware is just bonkers. So that's the end of my rant. Also, I will state that any good photographer is not constantly upgrading equipment. And I'm not saying that they can't. It's that they don't have a desire to do so. Because even if they're staying with it, internally inside their one ecosystem for glass, if there are software changes, ergonomic changes, dial, functionality changes, they don't want to have to relearn that every year. And most great photographers are going to stick with a camera like this for possibly a decade, unless something comes out that can change the way they work. So, and most pro photographers are not using necessarily the latest and greatest cameras, and those of you who work in photography know that firsthand. I think hobbyists, enthusiasts sort of get this, brainwashed idea that pros are out there buying new gear like gearheads. I'm not saying they aren't gearheads, but business is business. And if you can make the same money with your 5-year-old camera as a brand new one that will set you back $6,500, I don't need to really explain much more, do I? So, hopefully this has brought everybody back to reality. I mean, even my own wedding photographer, who is amazing, incredibly talented, he's shooting on old Canon gear, and I showed him this camera, and, he really wasn't interested, and I get it. The question is why everyone else doesn't. So again, the A1 is an amazing camera. This firmware update hopefully is a stepping stone to a larger firmware update, which I believe it is, but I also know that I'm content with what I have now. And part of what I do here on the channel is I try to make it so that, and I'll put this down finally because my left arm is going, hopefully, the service I'm providing is that when you go out and you make a purchase like the A1 or the R5 or any piece of computer hardware, smartphone, gaming peripheral, whatever it is, that you're coming away with a sound decision. Buyer's remorse shouldn't be part of the plan. It's very difficult to eliminate buyer's remorse. I try to do the best, not just for all of you, but for myself. Nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect in this world. So at the end of the day, you do your best to make a sound choice, but you do not, it's just, again, ridiculous and unrealistic to say well, because this was so expensive, I expect more than what I bought. That's just ludicrous. So, again, one firmware update. Historically, Sony puts out these little stability firmware updates before a larger one, depending on the camera. They don't always have to do it. They didn't have to do it with my FX3 that I'm recording on now. But hopefully that's the direction we're trending. And we're going to see one final nice, solid update for this camera that will give it not new features, but features that it can take on because they've written it for new launches, like the R5. And the same applies to the A7S III. I think that all of you who were early adopters on that camera, I held off until the FX3 launched because to me it was clearly more of a video tool than the A7S III, which I know makes people nuts, but I had so many of you out there telling me, like, why did I waste the money on the FX3? And the reason was because Sony was calling it a cinema camera. It was more expensive, not just because of the XLR handle, the design language, the active cooling system, the tally lights. These were all things that clearly made it less of a hybrid than the A7S III. And the history of the A7S is hybrid capability, low light wonder. So it's clear to me the distinction they made between the two, even if the hardware is nearly identical. And these are things people have to take into account. You know, this is why making choices isn't always easy. But what I can tell you is it's not a choice to complain and basically jump ship because you want to be a crybaby. And I'm not saying wanting new firmware is being one, but a lot of this sulking that I've been reading about, from comments and forums to videos, I'm not naming anybody, it's all, immature and unfortunately seems to speak to an unrealistic view of what business entails in any sense of the word, not just electronics or cameras, but everything. Let me know when, the latest or a year-old iPhone is going to get all of the firmware up to, oh wait, it's not going to, because that's Apple's entire business model. One iPhone to the next generation may not really be very different, but software is what they're selling, right? People are upgrading not because the hardware has changed, but because new features that are in the software are not going to be there unless they spend new money. I think Apple, I understand if people came out against Apple because they are so egregious in what they do with essentially ripping off consumers. But the A1 was brilliant at launch, enough said. The A7S III, also a brilliant camera at launch. The FX3, a lot of people had questions because it was a cinema camera without DCI 4K. We've got that now. That makes sense. Should it have taken this long? No. But I said it was the end of the rant earlier. I gave you a little tail. But that rounds things out. Love the A1. The R5 is an amazing camera, but it's got a year and a half on the A1. I still think the A1's the better camera, but you'll have to tune into my full comparison between the two to get that breakdown. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.